"Sir, your kid doesn't belong in first class." The words sliced through the quiet cabin so sharply that conversation stopped before the engines had even begun to hum. Heads turned one by one as every pair of eyes landed on a 12-year-old black boy sitting alone in seat 2A. His backpack neatly tucked beneath the seat in front of him, his hands folded calmly in his lap exactly as his father had instructed only minutes earlier. His name was Ethan Carter, and despite the growing attention surrounding him, there wasn't a trace of fear on his face. He simply looked up at the flight attendant with the kind of quiet confidence that seemed almost unusual for someone his age. Flight attendant Nicole Harrison stood in the aisle with perfectly pressed navy blue sleeves, her service smile already gone. She glanced from Ethan's simple hoodie to his worn sneakers before looking back at the first-class cabin as though something had been placed where it didn't belong. Around them, passengers exchanged uncertain looks. Some assumed there had been a mistake. Others immediately believed the uniform. A businessman loosened his tie and whispered to his wife that the boy must have wandered forward from economy. Across the aisle, an elderly woman frowned, studying Ethan's boarding pass still resting on the armrest beside him. Nicole folded her arms. "Sweetheart, this cabin is reserved for premium passengers. Let's not make this difficult." Ethan answered politely without raising his voice. "My ticket says 2A. Nicole didn't even glance at it. "Your parents can find you once you're back where you belong." Ethan carefully picked up the boarding pass and held it out with both hands. "My dad told me to stay right here until he comes back." Nicole ignored the paper entirely. Instead, she looked toward the front galley where another crew member was organizing catering supplies. "Melissa," she called loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I think we've got another seating issue." The phrase spread through the cabin faster than turbulence. A few people sighed impatiently, assuming boarding would now be delayed. A young travel blogger seated in row 3 discreetly reached for her phone, not recording yet, simply sensing something felt wrong. Ethan remained still. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. His eyes drifted toward the open aircraft door where passengers continued filing on board beneath the warm afternoon sunlight spilling through the jet bridge. Somewhere beyond that doorway, his father was finishing a brief conversation with the gate agent after helping an elderly traveler retrieve a misplaced carry-on. Ethan knew he would be back any second. Nicole leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound patient but not kind. "Listen to me. If you don't move now, airport security may have to help us sort this out." Ethan blinked once. "I didn't do anything wrong." The words were simple, honest, and strangely powerful. For a brief moment, even the nearby passengers fell silent. Then Nicole exhaled dramatically and looked around as if asking the cabin to witness her inconvenience. "Children should know when adults are speaking," she muttered. The businessman nodded in agreement. But across the aisle, the elderly woman quietly shook her head. She had flown thousands of miles over 4 decades, and she recognized something familiar, not in the boy, but in the assumptions filling the aisle before anyone had bothered to verify a single fact. And just outside the aircraft door, footsteps were already drawing closer. Ethan Carter did not move. He kept both feet flat on the carpet beneath seat 2A and rested his boarding pass carefully on his lap as though the small piece of paper carried all the certainty he needed. His breathing stayed slow. His eyes remained fixed on the open aircraft door. Every few seconds another passenger stepped aboard, filling the first-class cabin with rolling carry-on bags, quiet greetings, and the familiar sounds of overhead bins closing one after another. Nicole Harrison interpreted his silence as defiance. She folded her arms tighter and looked toward the front galley again. Melissa, the senior flight attendant, approached with measured steps, expecting to solve an ordinary seating mix-up in less than a minute. Instead, she found a calm 12-year-old boy sitting exactly where his boarding pass indicated. "Young man," Melissa said gently, "may I see your ticket?" Ethan immediately handed it to her. Before she could finish reading the seat assignment, Nicole spoke over her shoulder. "He wandered into first class before boarding finished. His parents are probably still in the main cabin." Ethan answered before Melissa could respond. "My father asked me to stay here while he helped another passenger at the gate." Melissa glanced toward the open aircraft door, then back at the boarding pass. "Seat 2A, she read quietly. Nicole dismissed the words with a wave of her hand. Tickets get mixed up all the time. Across the aisle, the elderly woman finally spoke. Then perhaps someone should verify it before assuming the child is in the wrong place. A businessman 2 rows behind sighed loudly. We cannot delay an entire flight over this. Another passenger nodded in agreement without ever looking directly at Ethan. The travel blogger in row 3 now discreetly started recording, keeping her phone low against her handbag. Something about the growing tension no longer felt like a simple misunderstanding. Ethan remained remarkably composed. He remembered something his father had told him years earlier after another uncomfortable encounter inside a luxury store. People will sometimes decide who you are before they ever speak to you. Never let someone else's assumption decide how you carry yourself. Ethan had been only 8 years old then. He had not fully understood those words. Today, sitting quietly beneath the soft cabin lights, they suddenly made perfect sense. Melissa looked down once more at the boarding pass. Everything appears to match. Nicole stepped closer, lowering her voice. You are new on this route. Trust me. I know when something does not add up. Melissa hesitated. Training encouraged verification. Experience encouraged teamwork. The conflict settled across her face before she reluctantly handed the boarding pass back to Ethan. Please wait here, she said softly. Nicole immediately reached for the interphone near the galley entrance and requested that the lead gate supervisor remain nearby until boarding was complete. Several passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The atmosphere inside the elegant cabin had changed completely. What had started as an ordinary afternoon departure now felt strangely heavy, as though everyone sensed that an invisible line had already been crossed. Ethan simply looked once more toward the aircraft door. A faint smile appeared on his face. He had just recognized a familiar pair of footsteps approaching from the jet bridge, steady, unhurried, and impossible for him to mistake. The footsteps stopped just outside the aircraft door, but the man who had approached did not step inside immediately. Instead, he paused to help a retired Army veteran lift a heavy carry-on into the overhead compartment near the entrance. Ethan recognized the familiar calm in every movement and relaxed even more, certain his father would appear within moments. Inside the cabin, however, Nicole Harrison interpreted the boy's confidence as stubbornness. She looked toward the gate where a uniformed ground supervisor had arrived after her request. There he is, Nicole said. We have a child refusing crew instructions before departure. The supervisor glanced toward Ethan, expecting tears or panic. Instead, he found a polite young passenger sitting quietly with his boarding pass resting neatly on his lap. Son, the supervisor asked, is an adult traveling with you today? Ethan nodded. Yes, sir. My father is boarding right now. Nicole answered before Ethan could continue. That is exactly what he has been saying for the last several minutes. A few nearby passengers chuckled softly. The businessman leaned back with folded arms. If his father was really in first class, he would already be here. Another passenger quietly agreed. Families usually board together. The elderly woman looked directly at them. Or perhaps there is a reason you do not know. Her words lingered briefly before disappearing beneath the growing noise of boarding. Melissa watched the exchange with increasing discomfort. Something about the situation continued to bother her. She had personally seen the boarding pass, and nothing about it appeared unusual. Yet the assumptions inside the cabin seemed to multiply faster than the facts. The travel blogger kept recording discreetly, capturing expressions instead of faces, sensing that the real story was unfolding in the reactions around the child, rather than the child himself. Ethan remembered another lesson from his father during a quiet Saturday afternoon years earlier. They had been walking through a neighborhood park when another parent mistakenly assumed Ethan was separated from his family. His father had simply smiled afterward and said, "People often rush to conclusions because conclusions are easier than conversations." At the time, Ethan thought it sounded like one of those grown-up sayings that only adults understood. Sitting in seat 2A now, surrounded by strangers deciding his story before asking a single real question, those words echoed with surprising clarity. Nicole took one more step into the aisle. "If your father is boarding," she said firmly, "then he can explain why you are sitting in a premium cabin." Ethan answered without hesitation. "He does not need to explain anything. The businessman laughed quietly. Confident kid. The elderly woman replied. Perhaps confidence comes from knowing the truth. Before anyone could respond, the sound of polished dress shoes crossed the jet bridge. Conversations faded almost instinctively. A tall black man wearing a charcoal hoodie, dark jeans, and carrying nothing more than a slim leather briefcase stepped through the aircraft door with an easy smile, thanking the gate agent for assisting the veteran behind him. His eyes immediately found Ethan, then noticed the unusual silence hanging over the first-class cabin. The smile disappeared, replaced not by anger, but by careful attention. Without raising his voice or quickening his pace, he walked forward, taking in every uneasy expression before calmly asking a single question that seemed to stop the entire cabin from breathing. Can someone tell me why my son is being treated like he does not belong here? The question settled over the cabin with surprising weight. No one answered immediately. The usual sounds of boarding seemed to fade behind an uncomfortable silence that stretched from the cockpit door to the last row of first class. The tall man stood beside Ethan's seat with one hand resting lightly on the leather briefcase at his side, his attention fixed not on the passengers but on the crew member standing in the aisle. Ethan looked up with complete relief. "Dad," he said quietly, "I stayed where you told me." The man nodded once. "I know you did." Nicole Harrison stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "Sir, your son refused repeated instructions to relocate while we sorted out a seating issue." The man glanced at Ethan's boarding pass, then at the seat number above him before calmly asking, "What seating issue?" Melissa lowered her eyes for a moment. She knew there had never been a discrepancy on the boarding pass itself. The uncertainty had come from assumptions rather than evidence. Before Nicole could continue, the elderly woman across the aisle cleared her throat. "Young man," she said, looking directly at the father, "your son has been respectful from the moment I boarded. He never argued. He simply kept saying you asked him to remain here." The businessman shifted uncomfortably but still defended the situation. People were only trying to keep the boarding process moving. The elderly woman answered without hesitation. Efficiency should never replace fairness. Her words lingered in the air like a quiet verdict. The travel blogger continued recording from row 3, now focusing on the conversation itself rather than the faces. Thousands of similar moments happened every day, but very few unfolded this calmly. She sensed that composure was becoming the most powerful voice in the cabin. The father smiled politely at the elderly woman. "Thank you for speaking when it mattered." Then he returned his attention to Nicole. "May I ask whether anyone actually scanned my son's boarding pass after questioning him?" Nicole hesitated for the first time. "We believed there was reason to question whether he belonged in this cabin." "That was not my question," he replied in the same measured tone. Melissa finally spoke. "I examined the boarding pass. Everything matched the reservation." Nicole immediately interrupted. "But appearances can be misleading." The father looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of passengers one after another. "Interesting," he said softly. "My son presented a valid boarding pass, remained polite, followed instructions, and waited exactly where I asked him to wait. Yet appearances became more convincing than facts." No one responded. Even the businessman looked away. The ground supervisor shifted his weight, sensing that the situation had become far more complicated than a routine boarding concern. Ethan quietly reached for his backpack and placed it on his lap, preparing to move if his father requested it. Instead, his father gently placed a hand on the top of the bag. "You do not need to move, Ethan." The words were calm, but they carried unmistakable certainty. Melissa looked from the father to Nicole, then toward the open aircraft door where the last few passengers were boarding. She took a slow breath before saying the words that changed the direction of the entire encounter. "I verified his reservation myself. Seat 2A has belonged to Ethan Carter since check-in this morning." The cabin remained silent after Melissa's confirmation. Those few words carried more weight than anyone expected because they removed the last excuse that this had been a simple misunderstanding. Ethan had been assigned seat 2A from the very beginning. His father looked down at him with quiet pride before gently straightening the collar of his hoodie. "You handled yourself exactly the way we talked about," he said. Ethan smiled faintly. "I remembered what you always tell me." His father nodded. Good. Character becomes visible when circumstances become difficult. Several passengers lowered their eyes. The businessman who had spoken so confidently only moments earlier suddenly found the view outside the window much more interesting than the conversation unfolding beside him. The elderly woman gave Ethan an encouraging smile that he quietly returned. Nicole Harrison, however, refused to let the moment settle. Sir, regardless of the reservation, we have procedures that must be followed before departure. The father answered with the same calm expression. I appreciate procedures. I work with procedures every day. What concerns me is whether they were followed equally. The ground supervisor stepped forward. Perhaps we should continue this discussion after boarding is complete. I agree, the father replied. But first I would like every fact preserved exactly as it happened. He reached into the pocket of his hoodie and removed a simple smartphone. There was nothing flashy about it, nothing that suggested status or wealth. He pressed one number from his favorites list and waited only a second before the call connected. Good afternoon, Angela, he said in an even tone. Please document the current boarding delay on Flight 278. I also need the boarding records, gate security footage, cabin service logs, and any passenger incident reports preserved immediately. Yes, all of them. Thank you. He ended the call without raising his voice or offering a single explanation. Nicole exchanged a quick glance with the ground supervisor. Who exactly was that? She asked. The father slipped the phone back into his pocket. Someone whose job is making sure facts are never lost. The answer only deepened the uncertainty spreading through the cabin. Melissa noticed Nicole's confidence beginning to fade for the first time. This no longer felt like an ordinary customer complaint. The travel blogger continued recording discreetly, realizing that the most remarkable part of the encounter was not anger but discipline. The father had never interrupted anyone, never accused anyone, and never spoken above a conversational tone. Yet every sentence seemed to shift the balance of the room. Ethan watched him with complete trust because none of this surprised him. He had seen his father solve difficult situations exactly the same way at home, at school meetings, and during community events. Calm first. Facts second. Decisions last. The ground supervisor cleared his throat. Sir, may I have your name for the report? The father looked at him politely but did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced once around the first-class cabin, meeting the eyes of every passenger who had silently judged his son before finally returning his attention to the supervisor. A faint smile crossed his face, not because he enjoyed the moment, but because he understood that the truth no longer needed to be rushed. Of course, he said. You will have my name in just a moment. I simply want everyone here to remember exactly what happened before they learn who I am. No one spoke after those words. The quiet inside the first-class cabin no longer felt ordinary. It felt deliberate, as though every passenger suddenly understood that whatever happened next would matter far beyond a delayed departure. The ground supervisor lowered the small tablet in his hand. He had asked for a name expecting a routine report. Instead, he found himself standing before someone whose confidence came without the slightest need to impress anyone. Nicole Harrison crossed her arms once again, trying to recover the certainty she had carried only minutes earlier. With respect, sir. Every passenger is expected to cooperate with airline personnel. The father gave a small nod. I completely agree. His answer caught her off guard. She had expected an argument. Instead, he continued in the same calm voice. Respect for procedures protects both employees and passengers. That is exactly why procedures should begin with verification instead of assumptions. Melissa quietly looked down. She knew every word was true. During training, crew members were taught to verify boarding information before reaching conclusions. Somewhere between habit and hurried judgment, that principle had been forgotten. Ethan remained seated beside his father, listening without interruption. He noticed several passengers who had avoided looking at him earlier now offering small, apologetic smiles. He returned each one with simple kindness. His father had always told him that accepting someone's sincere change of heart required just as much strength as standing firm in the first place. The elderly woman leaned slightly into the aisle. Young man, she said to the father, you raised him well. He smiled warmly. Thank you, ma'am. I try to teach him that dignity is something nobody else can hand to you, and nobody else can take away. Those words settled over the cabin with remarkable force. Even the businessman who had questioned Ethan earlier slowly removed his glasses and quietly said, "I should have waited before making assumptions. I apologize." Ethan looked toward him and answered with the same calm he had shown from the beginning. "Thank you, sir." There was no bitterness in his voice, only honesty. The travel blogger continued recording, realizing that the most meaningful moment was not conflict but accountability. People were beginning to examine their own reactions instead of defending them. Suddenly, the interphone near the front galley chimed. Melissa answered immediately. Her expression changed almost at once. "Yes, I understand. Right away." She slowly lowered the receiver and turned toward the ground supervisor. "Operations wants to speak with the passenger in seat 2A. And his father before boarding is completed." Nicole frowned. "Operations?" Melissa nodded. "They said the request came through executive priority." A murmur spread across the cabin. Executive priority calls almost never interrupted boarding, unless something unusually significant had occurred. The ground supervisor looked back at the father with growing curiosity. "Sir, may I ask again for your name?" This time the father reached into the inside pocket of his hoodie and removed a simple leather card holder. He opened it without drama, selected one business card, and handed it over with steady hands. The supervisor glanced down casually at first, but within seconds the color drained from his face. His eyes moved from the card back to the man standing before him, then back to the card once more, as though hoping he had somehow read it incorrectly. The silence that followed was heavier than any raised voice could ever have been. The ground supervisor stared at the business card as though the words had rearranged themselves after he first read them. His lips parted slightly before he looked back at the man standing beside Ethan. The card was simple, with no gold lettering or elaborate design, yet the title printed beneath the name carried unmistakable authority. Marcus Carter, Chief Executive Officer, Carter Aviation Holdings, Strategic Partner and Principal Investor. The supervisor swallowed hard and instinctively straightened his posture. "Mr. Carter," he said quietly, "I did not realize." Marcus offered a courteous smile. "That is exactly the point. Nobody should have to be recognized before they are treated with respect." Those words settled over the cabin more heavily than any announcement from the cockpit ever could. Nicole Harrison felt the color leave her face as she looked from the business card to Marcus and then toward Ethan. She replayed every assumption she had made since boarding began. None of them had been based on facts. Melissa remained still, her expression reflecting both relief and regret. She had trusted the boarding pass but had not trusted her own judgment strongly enough when it mattered most. Before anyone could respond, the interphone rang again. Melissa answered immediately. "Yes. This is the lead cabin crew." She listened for several seconds before handing the receiver directly to Marcus. "They are asking for you, sir." Marcus accepted the handset calmly. "Marcus Carter speaking." His voice remained measured as he listened. "Thank you. I appreciate the prompt response. My primary concern is that every employee involved receives a fair review based on verified facts, not assumptions from either side. Please preserve every report, every recording, and every communication related to today's boarding process. That is all I ask." He handed the receiver back without another word. The passengers exchanged puzzled looks. Many had expected demands, outrage, or threats. Instead, they had witnessed restraint paired with absolute confidence. The businessman who had apologized earlier quietly shook his head in disbelief. "He is protecting the process even after everything that happened," he murmured. The elderly woman smiled gently. "That is what real leadership looks like." The travel blogger lowered her phone for the first time since boarding began. She realized that no dramatic narration could improve what she had just witnessed. The story spoke for itself. Ethan looked up at his father with unmistakable pride. "Dad," he asked softly, "are we still going to make it to Grandma's birthday dinner?" Marcus smiled, the tension finally easing from his face. "That is still the plan." The simple exchange reminded everyone watching that beyond the titles, investments, and executive phone calls stood a father whose only priority had been protecting his son with dignity. At that very moment, The captain emerged from the cockpit and walked quickly toward the front of the cabin. His expression was professional, but the respect in his posture was unmistakable. He extended his hand toward Marcus. "Mr. Carter," he said, "on behalf of our flight crew, I would like to personally thank you for your patience. Our executive leadership team has requested that we pause departure for just a few more minutes while they address this matter directly." Every passenger in first class understood that the truth had now reached far beyond the cabin door, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. The captain remained beside Marcus Carter with quiet respect as another call arrived from the airline's operations center. This time he answered on speaker at the request of executive leadership so everyone directly involved could hear the same information. A composed voice introduced herself as the Executive Vice President of Customer Experience. "Mr. Carter, thank you for your patience. We have already secured the boarding records, cabin communications, and gate reports exactly as you requested. An immediate internal review has been initiated, and the employees involved have been temporarily removed from duty pending that review. We are committed to evaluating the facts carefully and fairly." The cabin fell completely silent. Nobody had expected decisions to move so quickly. Nicole Harrison stood motionless. Only minutes earlier she had carried herself with complete certainty. Now she understood that certainty without verification had brought her to this moment. Melissa quietly removed her own name badge for a moment before fastening it again, taking a slow breath as though reminding herself that every uniform represented responsibility before authority. The ground supervisor nodded respectfully toward Marcus. "Thank you for insisting that every fact be preserved instead of asking us to rush to judgment." Marcus returned the gesture with a calm smile. Accountability should never depend on emotion. It should depend on evidence. The elderly woman looked across the aisle at Ethan. "I hope you remember today for the right reason," she said softly. Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "I think I will remember the people who chose to speak up." Melissa felt those words deeply. She stepped forward and addressed Ethan directly. "I should have trusted the verified information sooner. And I should have spoken more firmly when I knew your reservation was correct. I am sincerely sorry." Ethan looked toward his father, who gave a small approving nod. "Thank you for saying that," Ethan replied. "That means a lot." The businessman who had questioned Ethan earlier also stood from his seat. "Young man, I judged the situation before I understood it. I owe you an apology as well." Ethan smiled politely. "Thank you, sir." The travel blogger quietly lowered her phone. She realized the most powerful ending to her recording would not be conflict, but people choosing honesty over pride. Moments later, two airport managers entered the aircraft and respectfully asked Nicole to accompany them off the flight while the review proceeded. There was no argument, no raised voices, and no public humiliation. She simply nodded, gathered her belongings, and walked toward the aircraft door with a thoughtful expression that suggested she understood the seriousness of what had happened. Several passengers watched in silence, recognizing that accountability did not require anger to carry weight. Before leaving, one of the managers turned toward Marcus. "Mr. Carter, thank you for allowing us the opportunity to address this properly." Marcus answered with the same steady composure he had shown from the beginning. "I did not want special treatment for my family. I wanted the same fairness every family deserves." Those words settled over the first-class cabin with quiet permanence. In that moment, everyone understood that the real lesson had never been about status, wealth, or influence. It had always been about the simple choice to see a person before forming a conclusion, because respect offered after someone's title is revealed is far less meaningful than respect offered from the very beginning. The aircraft door finally closed, and for the first time since boarding began, the cabin felt peaceful. The captain welcomed everyone aboard once again, thanking the passengers for their patience before the safety demonstration resumed. Yet very few people paid attention to the routine announcement. Their thoughts remained fixed on the quiet father and son seated together in row 2. Marcus Carter placed his briefcase beneath the seat and turned toward Ethan with the same calm smile he had worn throughout the entire ordeal. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "I am glad you came back when you did, but I think I would have been all right because I remembered what you taught me." Marcus nodded proudly. "And what was that?" Ethan looked out the window as the aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate. That I cannot control what people assume about me, but I can always control how I respond. Marcus smiled. That lesson will carry you farther than any airplane ever could. Across the aisle, the elderly woman quietly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye before leaning toward Ethan one final time. Young man, she said warmly, never lose that strength. Ethan thanked her with the same kindness he had shown from the beginning. The businessman also walked over before returning to his own seat. Mr. Carter, he said sincerely, today reminded me that success does not always announce itself, and character certainly does not come with a dress code. Thank you for teaching all of us something. Marcus shook his hand without hesitation. We all have opportunities to learn. What matters is whether we choose to grow afterward. A few rows behind them, the travel blogger quietly ended her recording. She knew the story she would eventually share would not focus on a wealthy executive or a delayed flight. It would focus on a child who remained respectful while others rushed to conclusions, and on a father who proved that dignity speaks louder than anger. As the airplane climbed above the clouds, sunlight filled the cabin, washing away the tension that had lingered only minutes earlier. Ethan looked through the window at the endless blue sky. Dad, he said softly, do you think people can really change? Marcus took a slow breath before answering. Some will not. But every time we respond with integrity instead of bitterness, we give someone the chance to see the world differently. That opportunity is always worth protecting. Ethan nodded quietly, carrying those words with him as carefully as he carried every lesson his father had ever given him. The flight continued without another interruption, but no one in first class would remember it for the destination printed on their boarding pass. They would remember the moment assumptions collided with truth, when calm defeated prejudice without raising a voice, and when genuine leadership was revealed not by wealth, authority, or recognition, but by unwavering respect for every person's dignity. Long after the airplane disappeared beyond the horizon, the lesson remained simple enough for anyone to carry into everyday life. Treat every stranger with fairness before you know their story, because the measure of your character is never found in how you greet the powerful after learning who they are, but in how you honor the humanity of someone whose name you have not yet heard.